The students called him Mr. Fossil behind his back, mocked his old-fashioned clothes, and rolled their eyes when the 68-year-old substitute teacher struggled with the smart board. For 3 months, Robert Chen endured their disrespect with quiet dignity, never defending himself, never raising his voice. But when the principal called an emergency assembly to address the bullying, what they revealed about their worthless old sub would silence an entire school and shame every student who had ever laughed at him. Robert Chen arrives at Lincoln High School every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., 30 minutes before the first bell rings. At 68, Robert moves with the deliberate precision of someone who has spent decades understanding that preparation prevents failure, though the students he teaches have no appreciation for the military discipline that governs his daily routine. Robert's substitute teaching uniform never varies: pressed khaki pants, a button-down shirt in white or light blue, a navy blazer that he's owned for 15 years, and black leather shoes that he polishes every Sunday evening. To the fashion-conscious teenagers at Lincoln High, Robert's wardrobe looks like it came from a thrift store clearance rack. They have no way of knowing that Robert's sense of dress was shaped by 37 years of military service, where appearance reflected discipline, respect, and attention to detail. The students see an old man who struggles with technology, moves slowly, and teaches with methods that seem ancient compared to their digital world. What they don't see is a man who spent 3 decades teaching military strategy and leadership at the United States Military Academy at West Point, educating future generals and shaping the minds that would lead America's armed forces. What they especially don't see is the Congressional Medal of Honor recipient who was awarded the nation's highest military decoration for single-handedly holding off an enemy assault for 6 hours in Vietnam, saving the lives of 43 soldiers while wounded and outnumbered 20-1. Robert became a substitute teacher not because he needed the modest income, but because he missed the classroom environment that had defined his professional life for nearly 4 decades. After retiring from West Point at the rank of colonel, Robert found civilian retirement lonely and purposeless. Teaching teenagers wasn't the same as instructing military cadets, but it gave him a reason to get up in the morning and a way to contribute to his community. Room 12B at Lincoln High School has become Robert's regular assignment for the past 3 months. It's Mrs. Patterson's usual classroom, but she's been on extended medical leave, so Robert has become the semi-permanent substitute for her advanced placement history classes. The students in these classes are academically capable but socially ruthless. They're smart enough to know that substitute teachers have limited authority and minimal connection to their permanent academic records. They're also at the age where establishing social hierarchy often involves targeting anyone perceived as weak, different, or unable to fight back. Robert became their target on his very first day. It started with whispered comments about his appearance. "Look at his outfit," Madison whispered to her friend Ashley during the Pledge of Allegiance. "I think my grandfather has the same blazer." Ashley responded with barely suppressed laughter, which encouraged Madison to continue. "And did you see how he fumbled with the smart board? This is going to be the easiest class ever." The comments escalated over the following weeks. Students began referring to Robert as Mr. Fossil whenever he was out of earshot, though sometimes they weren't particularly careful about keeping their voices down. They rolled their eyes dramatically when he asked them to put away their phones. They sighed loudly whenever he attempted to use the classroom's technology. They exchanged knowing looks when he mispronounced the names of apps or social media platforms they referenced. Jake Morrison, a popular senior who played varsity football and had already been accepted to 3 colleges, began leading what he considered harmless mockery of their substitute teacher. "Mr. Chen," Jake would say with exaggerated politeness, "could you explain how people learned things before the internet? You know, back in your day." This would trigger snickers from other students and encourage additional comments about Robert's age and perceived obsolescence. Robert endured these interactions with patience that baffled some students and emboldened others. He never raised his voice, never sent students to the principal's office, never responded to disrespect with anger. Instead, he continued teaching with quiet dignity, focusing on students who were genuinely interested in learning and ignoring those who weren't. What the students interpreted as weakness was actually strength forged in situations where losing composure could mean the difference between life and death. Robert had commanded respect through competence and leadership, not through intimidation or punishment. High school mockery, while personally painful, didn't register as a genuine threat requiring military-level response. but Robert's patience was being noticed by others in the school community. Sarah Williams, a junior who had been largely invisible to her more popular classmates, began observing the dynamic between Robert and his tormentors with growing discomfort. Sarah was the daughter of a military family. Her father had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and she recognized something in Robert's bearing that her classmates missed entirely. Sarah noticed that Robert's historical knowledge went far beyond the standard curriculum. When discussing the Vietnam War, he provided tactical details and strategic insights that weren't in their textbook. When covering World War II, he explained military decision-making with the authority of someone who had studied these campaigns professionally, not just academically. Most telling, Sarah noticed that Robert kept a small, faded photograph tucked inside his lesson planner. She could only see the edge of it when he opened the planner to check his notes, but it appeared to be a military photograph, black and white, showing a group of soldiers in combat fatigues. The situation in room 12B reached a turning point on a Wednesday in November when Jake Morrison decided to escalate his harassment of Robert into a full classroom performance. Robert was attempting to connect the classroom's laptop to the smartboard for a presentation about the Korean War when the technology failed to cooperate as expected. The connection kept dropping, the display kept flickering, and the audio wasn't syncing properly. Robert worked patiently through the technical difficulties, but each failed attempt prompted more snickers and eye-rolling from his audience. "Mr. Chen," Jake called out in a voice loud enough for the entire class to hear, "maybe we should just use a chalkboard. I bet you're more comfortable with that ancient technology." This triggered laughter from several students and encouraged Jake to continue. "Or maybe we could learn about the Korean War from someone who was actually there. You're old enough, right?" The laughter grew louder, and other students began joining in with their own comments about Robert's age and technological incompetence. "Maybe he fought in the Korean War," suggested Tyler, another popular athlete. "That's why he knows so much about military history. He lived through it." Robert paused in his struggle with the smartboard and turned to face the class. For a moment his expression showed something that hadn't been visible during months of patient endurance, not anger, but deep sadness mixed with disappointment. "The Korean War ended in 1953, Robert said quietly. "I was born in 1955, so no, I didn't serve in Korea, but you're right that I have personal experience with military history." The room fell silent, not because the students were interested in Robert's response, but because something in his tone suggested that their joke had touched on something more serious than they intended. Jake, emboldened by the attention he was receiving from his classmates, decided to push further. "Oh, so you were in Vietnam then? Did you draft dodge, or were you just too scared to fight?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Several students looked uncomfortable with Jake's escalation, but no one spoke up to stop him. Robert looked at Jake for several long seconds, and for the first time since he'd started teaching at Lincoln High, his military bearing became clearly visible to anyone paying attention. "I served 3 tours in Vietnam," Robert said simply. "Anything else you'd like to know about my service record?" Jake, realizing he had ventured into territory he didn't understand, tried to retreat with a joke. "Well, that explains why you're so good at boring us to death with war stories." The laughter that followed was nervous rather than amused, but it was enough to convince Jake that he had successfully deflected the uncomfortable moment he had created. Robert turned back to the smartboard without another word and continued his presentation using the classroom's older projection system. He taught the remainder of the class with his usual quiet competence, but several students noticed that something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. The patience was still there, but it was now accompanied by something that looked like resolve. After class, Sarah Williams approached Robert's desk. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "I wanted to apologize for how some of my classmates have been treating you. It's not right, and it's not how everyone in this school feels." Robert looked up from the papers he was organizing and gave Sarah a small smile. "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that more than you know. Mr. Chen, can I ask you something?" Sarah continued. "That photograph in your lesson planner, is that from when you served in Vietnam?" Robert hesitated for a moment, then opened his planner and carefully removed the faded black and white photograph. He handed it to Sarah, who examined it closely. The photograph showed a group of young soldiers, barely older than Sarah herself, standing in what appeared to be a military base camp. They were wearing combat fatigues and carrying rifles, but they were smiling at the camera with the kind of camaraderie that develops between people who depend on each other for survival. "That's my unit," Robert said simply. "Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment." This was taken in 1975, about 2 weeks before the evacuation of Saigon. Sarah studied the photograph more carefully and realized that one of the young soldiers, a man who looked to be in his early 20s, bore a clear resemblance to Robert, though he was decades younger and wearing military gear that made him appear strong and capable in ways that his substitute teacher appearance concealed. "This is you," Sarah said, pointing to the young soldier. "That's me," Robert confirmed. "Lieutenant Robert Chen, 27th Infantry Regiment. I was 20 years old in that photograph." Sarah handed the photograph back to Robert with new understanding of why her classmates' jokes had been so inappropriate and hurtful. "Mr. Chen, why don't you tell people about your military service? Maybe if they knew." "Sarah," Robert interrupted gently, "respect isn't something you should have to earn by proving your credentials. It's something people should offer each other as basic human decency. If I have to show my military record to receive respectful treatment, then the problem isn't with my qualifications, it's with how we treat each other." Sarah nodded, but she also realized that Robert's philosophy, while admirable, wasn't protecting him from daily humiliation at the hands of students who had no idea what they were doing. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would change everything for Robert and for Lincoln High School. Sarah's father, Master Sergeant David Williams, was stationed at the local army base and had served multiple tours in both Afghanistan and Iraq. When Sarah told him about her substitute teacher and showed him a photo she had discreetly taken of Robert's military photograph, her father's reaction was immediate and intense. "Sarah, describe this teacher to me again," Master Sergeant Williams said, studying the photograph with growing excitement. "His name is Robert Chen. He's about 68 years old, and he taught at some military school before becoming a substitute teacher. The kids at school make fun of him because he's old and doesn't understand technology, but I think he's actually a war hero or something." Master Sergeant Williams was quiet for several minutes, staring at the photograph and processing information that Sarah couldn't understand. "Sarah," he finally said, "I need you to find out your teacher's full name and his military rank. This is very important." The next day, Sarah approached Robert after class with her father's questions. Robert, sensing that this was more than casual curiosity, provided the information Sarah requested. "My full name is Colonel Robert Chen, United States Army, retired. I served from 1973 to 2010. Sarah reported this information to her father, who spent that evening making phone calls to contacts in the military community. What he discovered would shock everyone at Lincoln High School. Colonel Robert Chen was not just a Vietnam veteran, he was a living legend in military circles. In 1975, during the evacuation of Saigon, then Lieutenant Chen had single-handedly held off a North Vietnamese assault on the evacuation site for over 6 hours, allowing hundreds of American civilians and South Vietnamese allies to escape safely. Despite being wounded multiple times and vastly outnumbered, Chen had refused evacuation himself until every person under his protection had been safely removed. For his actions that day, Robert Chen was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. He was 20 years old at the time, making him one of the youngest recipients in the award's history. After Vietnam, Chen had been recruited to teach at West Point, where he spent the next 35 years educating future military leaders. He had written 3 books on military strategy that were still used as textbooks at military academies. He had advised Pentagon officials on counterinsurgency operations and had been consulted by every presidential administration since 1980 on matters of military policy. Master Sergeant Williams realized that his daughter's substitute teacher was quite possibly the most decorated war hero in their entire community, and he was being mocked daily by students who had no concept of his sacrifices or achievements. The next morning, Master Sergeant Williams called Lincoln High School and requested a meeting with Principal Johnson. "Principal Johnson," Master Sergeant Williams began, "I need to talk to you about one of your substitute teachers, Colonel Robert Chen." "Oh, Mr. Chen," Principal Johnson replied with a slight sigh. He's a nice enough man, but I've been getting some complaints from parents about his teaching methods. Some students say he's outdated and has trouble with classroom management. Why do you ask? Master Sergeant Williams placed a folder on Principal Johnson's desk. Because you have a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient teaching in your school, and from what my daughter tells me, he's being treated with incredible disrespect by students who have no idea who he is. Principal Johnson opened the folder and began reading about Robert's military service and decorations. As he read, his expression changed from mild interest to shock to horror as he realized the magnitude of what had been happening in his school. "Oh my God," Principal Johnson whispered. "We had no idea. His application just listed his teaching experience at West Point. We didn't know about the Medal of Honor or his combat service." "Well, now you do," Master Sergeant Williams said firmly. "And I think it's time this school, and especially the students who have been mistreating him, learned about the hero who's been teaching their classes." Principal Johnson immediately began planning an emergency school assembly. But first he needed to speak with Robert privately to get his permission to share his story. When Principal Johnson approached Robert with the proposal to recognize his military service publicly, Robert's first reaction was reluctance. "Principal Johnson, I didn't come here seeking recognition. I came here to teach. If students can't show basic respect without knowing my military background, then we have a bigger problem than my credentials can solve." "Colonel Chen," Principal Johnson said, using Robert's military rank for the first time, "with respect, sir, this isn't just about you. This is about teaching our students a lesson they clearly need to learn about respect, service, and recognizing the heroes among us." Robert considered this argument and realized that Principal Johnson was right. The issue wasn't about his personal feelings, it was about educating young people who would soon be adults themselves, and who needed to understand the value of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. "All right," Robert agreed. "But I want to address the students directly. If we're going to do this, it should be educational, not just ceremonial." The following Monday, Lincoln High School held an emergency assembly. Students filed into the auditorium, expecting the usual presentations about attendance policies or standardized test schedules. Instead, they found Principal Johnson on stage with Master Sergeant Williams in full military dress uniform and several other local veterans who had come to honor their fellow serviceman. "Students and faculty," Principal Johnson began, "today we're here to address a serious problem that has been occurring in our school. For the past 3 months, we have had the honor of employing a substitute teacher who has been subjected to disrespectful treatment by some of our students. What those students didn't know, what none of us knew, is that they have been mocking and belittling one of America's greatest war heroes." The auditorium fell silent as students began to realize that their harmless jokes about Mr. Chen were about to have consequences they hadn't anticipated. Principal Johnson gestured to Robert, who walked onto the stage wearing his military dress uniform for the first time in years. The transformation was striking. Gone was the mild-mannered substitute teacher in outdated civilian clothes. In his place stood a decorated military officer whose bearing commanded immediate respect. "Students," Robert began, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded troops in combat, "I want to tell you about service, sacrifice, and respect." For the next 30 minutes, Robert shared his story. He talked about being a young soldier in Vietnam, about the friends he had lost, about the civilians he had protected during the evacuation of Saigon. He explained what it meant to serve your country, to put other people's lives before your own, and to carry the weight of leadership when failure meant death for the people depending on you. He also talked about coming home from war, about the challenges veterans faced when transitioning to civilian life, and about the importance of treating all people, regardless of age, appearance, or perceived status, with basic human dignity. When Robert finished speaking, the auditorium was completely silent. Students who had spent months making jokes about Mr. Fossil sat in stunned recognition of what they had done. Many were crying, including Jake Morrison, whose harmless jokes about Robert being too scared to fight had been so completely wrong that he felt physically sick with shame. Master Sergeant Williams then presented Robert with a framed copy of his Medal of Honor citation, reading aloud the official description of his heroic actions in Vietnam. As the citation was read, students began to understand that the man they had mocked was quite literally one of the bravest people they would ever meet. After the assembly, students lined up to apologize to Robert personally. Jake Morrison was among the first. "Colonel Chen," Jake said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I am so sorry for everything I said to you. I had no idea who you were, but that's no excuse. You deserved respect regardless of your background, and I failed to give it to you." Robert looked at Jake with the same patience he had shown during months of mockery, but now Jake could see the strength and wisdom that patience represented. "Jake," Robert said, "thank you for your apology. I accept it completely. But I want you to remember this feeling the next time you encounter someone who appears different or vulnerable. You never know what battles they've fought or what courage they've shown in circumstances you can't imagine." The transformation at Lincoln High School was immediate and lasting. Robert continued teaching as a substitute, but now his classes were among the most popular in the school. Students sought him out for advice, for stories about leadership and courage, and for the unique perspective that only someone with his experience could provide. 6 months after the assembly, Robert was hired as a full-time history teacher at Lincoln High School. His classes consistently had waiting lists, and students regularly said that learning from Colonel Chen was the most valuable educational experience of their high school careers. Jake Morrison, the student who had led much of the mockery, became one of Robert's most devoted students. Inspired by Robert's example, Jake chose to attend West Point after graduation, where he would study under textbooks that Robert had written decades earlier. On the day Jake left for West Point, he stopped by Robert's classroom one final time. "Colonel Chen," Jake said, "I want you to know that everything I've learned about leadership, I learned from watching how you handled being disrespected with dignity and grace. You could have destroyed us with anger, but instead you taught us with patience. That's the kind of leader I want to become." Robert smiled and shook Jake's hand. "Jake, true leadership isn't about commanding respect through fear or authority. It's about earning respect through character and using that respect to lift others up rather than tear them down." 1 year later, Lincoln High School dedicated their new Veterans Memorial to Colonel Robert Chen, not just for his service in Vietnam, but for his service to the students who had learned that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they wear outdated blazers and struggle with smart boards, waiting patiently for someone to see past the surface to the courage underneath. Robert Chen understood that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons on foreign battlefields. Sometimes they're fought with dignity in high school classrooms, where one person's patience can teach an entire generation about respect, service, and the true meaning of strength. Because real heroes don't demand recognition, they earn it through character, maintain it through humility, and share it by teaching others that courage comes in many forms, including the courage to treat every person as if they might be the most important person you'll ever meet. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel because tomorrow I have another story especially for you.